Okay, we have confirmation that the sound is now working, so I'm going to start again. All right, so my name is Jessica Turton, and for those of you who don't know me, I am an accredited practicing dietitian based in Sydney. And I'm also doing a PhD at the University of Sydney, investigating the role of low-carb diets in diabetes management.
It was only the last 2 slides were a cutout, so I think it was good up to that point.
Okay.
Yeah, and then, so did you want to fast forward a few slides?
Okay, yeah. So I might skip ahead to where it apparently cut out, which will probably be, maybe I should go from here. I'll just start from here. I'll just recap just in case. Okay, so what is salt? Salt is sodium chloride. A lot of people use salt and sodium interchangeably, but salt is not sodium. Salt contains sodium. So 1 teaspoon of salt contains about 2,200 milligrams of sodium. Now, sodium is an essential mineral that we could not live without. Sodium is needed for blood pressure and hydration. It's needed for energy production. It's needed for digestion and nutrient absorption. Sodium is needed for reproduction, muscle function, cellular communication, bone health, and pretty much everything that goes on inside our bodies. So when you actually look at the role that sodium plays in our bodies, it's pretty easy to see why it is so important. So salt has been demonized for such a long period of time. We have been absolutely brainwashed into thinking that salt is bad for us. And this picture accurately represents how most of my patients and most people commonly view salt today. So where did it all go so wrong? The salt blood pressure hypothesis is one of the main reasons that sodium and salt has been demonized. The theory goes that increased salt leads to increased blood pressure, leads to increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And what has been proven in some studies is that increased salt can increase blood pressure, and then reducing salt can reduce blood pressure. But this is only in some people. This is not everyone. And so the salt blood pressure hypothesis is literally just a theory. So it hasn't been proven with rigorous randomized controlled trials in its entirety. So in terms of what we do know, reducing salt may reduce blood pressure in some people, but it doesn't then mean that the risk of cardiovascular disease for those people is then reduced. And a main reason for this is that low salt diets can actually increase heart rate. So this has been shown in a meta-analysis of 63 randomized controlled trials, which include 72 different populations. And so the heart literally has to work harder to compensate for the drop in blood pressure caused by low salt intakes. So low salt diets do not reduce risk of heart disease. But another reason that low salt diets do not work is because they do not address the root cause of high blood pressure. It's like putting a Band-Aid over the problem. You can see that particular marker improve, but it doesn't actually improve overall health. And what we do know is that sodium retention is not caused by high intakes of salt. Sodium retention is actually caused by high levels of insulin. And most people at this conference will be familiar with insulin. So high levels of insulin is very well known to cause sodium retention and lead to increases in blood pressure. And so what causes high levels of insulin? Well, again, most people here understand that an excessive intake of carbohydrate and seed and vegetable oils that have been highly refined can lead to chronically high levels of insulin and then lead to increased blood pressure. Salt does not lead to high levels of insulin. In fact, low salt diets can actually cause the body to increase insulin levels in an attempt to hold on to the sodium. It doesn't want to lose the sodium, so it increases insulin. It tries to preserve it as much as possible. And so what you can actually see is that low salt intakes can lead to insulin resistance over the long term. And even if we do accept the idea that low salt diets have a potential benefit of reducing blood pressure, we have to weigh that out with a much greater list of likely risks associated with low salt diets. And we have to remember that sodium is an essential mineral for life. So it makes sense that a diet that restricts this essential mineral can lead to so many health issues in the long run. Okay, so how much salt should we actually eat? How much sodium do we need each day? So this is one of the largest studies that has been done on sodium intakes and associations with death and cardiovascular disease. This graph shows data from 100,000 participants across 17 countries. So 24-hour urinary sodium tests were performed on these participants, which is the best measure to determine how much sodium someone's eating across the day. And these participants were followed up for a long period of time and tracked to see who died and who developed cardiovascular diseases. And so what you can see very clearly is that the lowest risk of death and cardiovascular disease was associated with a sodium intake of 3,000 to 6,000 milligrams a day. That is equivalent to 1.5 to 3 teaspoons of salt. So this is the sodium sweet spot. But what's even more interesting is that diets with less than 3,000 milligrams a day were associated with a much greater risk of death and cardiovascular disease than sodium intakes above 6,000 milligrams a day. So this goes to reinforce how dangerous low salt diets actually are. And if you're not going to get in the sweet spot, overshooting kind of looks better than undershooting. The suggested dietary target for sodium is set at 2,000 milligrams per day. So you can see that what we are recommended to eat is not consistent with the lowest risk of death and cardiovascular events. Now, it wasn't until I started working at the Center for Gastrointestinal Health that I realized just how debilitating and dangerous low salt diets can be, especially for older adults. And so I thought I'd share a few patient cases with you so that you can see how low salt diets can play out in the real world. Now, these patients are referred to me by Dr. Pran Yoganathan, who you'll be hearing from later today. Pran is different to most gastroenterologists in the sense that he understands the powerful role that nutrition can play in gastrointestinal health and metabolic health. So I'm very lucky to be working alongside him and Thomas Parvola at the Center for Gastrointestinal Health, where we take a team-based approach to these patient issues. So patient number 1 is a 72-year-old male. He came to see me because he had chronic reflux and throat burning. Now, this was so bad that he couldn't actually keep food down. And he's an older male, so he was actually slowly deteriorating, losing a lot of muscle and also becoming very heavily depressed and low in energy. His wife literally told me that I was his last resort. When I did a diet history on this patient, I found out that he was severely restricting sodium to far less than 2,000 milligrams a day. Patient number 2 is a 69-year-old female who was referred to me for IBS, but upon assessment, I realized her primary issue was actually acute episodes of sweating and dizziness. This was so bad that she would sometimes completely black out. And she told me a story of this happening on the side of a busy road. A fall for this lady could mean a broken hip or even the end of her life. And upon assessment, again, she was restricting her sodium intake far below 2,000 milligrams a day. Patient number 3 is a 75-year-old female. She was referred to me because she was suffering from bowel urgency. This is a common GI issue that really impacts quality of life. This poor lady broke down in tears as she told me that she had to carry a spare pair of underwear with her everywhere she went. And she again was restricting her sodium far below 2,000 milligrams a day. Patient 4 is a 50-year-old female. Now her main goal was weight loss and she was stuck in the toxic dieting cycle. And she was really suffering as a result of this. Some of her issues from excessive dieting led to chronic constipation and daily headaches. And even though she was restricting her intake so badly, she still wasn't losing weight. Again, her sodium intake was heavily restricted. So I have to emphasize here that increasing sodium to this individual's requirements was not the only part of this intervention. Because as we discussed earlier, high levels of insulin that can be caused by an excessive intake of carbohydrate and processed foods can actually lead to sodium retention and a whole host of other chronic diseases. So we needed a diet that not only increased sodium to the individual requirements of these patients, but one that also focused on real whole food sources of proteins and fats and reduced an excessive intake of carbohydrates and basically eliminated refined carbohydrates and processed foods. Now, I know that nutrition is important, but even I was shocked at just how quickly these patients' debilitating issues could resolve with appropriate nutrition. And these patients, they did a very good job at following the advice that was given to them because they were so highly motivated. As I said, these are issues that they had been dealing with for years, and simply increasing salt in a lot of cases fixed their issues overnight. And then the diet change as well helped to improve things further. So what might a day of eating look like for someone who is increasing their sodium to the sweet spot and also focusing on a high protein, lower carb diet? So when we wake up in the morning, we're used to just heading straight for the coffee or straight for the tea. But overnight, we can lose a lot of sodium when we are asleep. And so the first thing we should be thinking about is hydration. Hydration refers to increasing electrolytes and water. So I recommend patients who need to increase their sodium to make a drink in the morning that has a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, some lemon, and some magnesium as well. And then if they want to follow that with a coffee, that's fine. But oftentimes I recommend people put a little pinch of salt in their coffee because caffeine itself can actually deplete you of sodium. So it helps to kind of balance out that loss. Now, meal number 1, you can see on the screen, there's a nice picture of it. The salty foods we have here are the prosciutto or smoked salmon is a really good option as well, and cheese. And because these foods have sodium naturally contained in them, this is a nice high sodium meal. Between meals, we look at focusing on sort of salty snacks. So a cup of salty bone broth, some salted nuts, and olives as well. This gives 800 milligrams of sodium. And then meal number 2 is again a nice high protein meal. And this meal contains some feta and some olives, which are rich in sodium. And the homemade mayonnaise in the middle contains a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. So across the day, that's 4,750 milligrams of sodium, which is roughly equivalent to about 2 teaspoons of salt. And that's right there in the sodium sweet spot. So some of you may be thinking that this looks easy, while others might be rushing to their pantries right now to go grab some salt to put in their coffee. But what the sodium sweet spot does not take into account is individual variation. Because we know that there are multiple factors that increase sodium requirements. And they do this either by increasing sodium losses or reducing sodium absorption. So people affected by these factors need to find their own sodium sweet spot. So some of the common factors that increase sodium requirements are listed on the screen here. And you can see that low carbohydrate diets are a big factor that increase sodium requirements. And that's because low levels of insulin and increased levels of ketones actually cause the body to lose more sodium on a daily basis. And in addition to that, a low carbohydrate diet typically focuses on real foods that are unprocessed. And it doesn't usually involve foods like breads and crackers and cereals, which are naturally high sodium foods where a lot of Australians get their sodium from. Caffeine is another factor that will significantly increase sodium requirements. Just 2 cups of coffee can deplete your body of a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And most people are having a lot more than this across the day. Again, I find this is a particular issue for older adults who are often having up to 10 cups of tea every single day. And they are also the ones that are diligently restricting their sodium intake. So their sodium losses would be very, very high. If we skip down the list to inflammatory bowel diseases, so these are things like celiac disease, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and even things like IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome. So these issues actually cause increased sodium losses through inflammatory symptoms like diarrhea, but also reduce sodium absorption. So if there's inflammation in the gastrointestinal tract, your body simply doesn't absorb nutrients as well. So that can lead to sodium deficiency. And because there are so many factors that most people here can probably resonate that affect your sodium requirements, and we can't always just rely on the sweet spot to know if we're getting enough, it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the signs and symptoms of sodium deficiency. Because if you're experiencing one or more of these symptoms of deficiency, whether that's now or in the future, you know that you need more salt. So these are some of the most common signs and symptoms of sodium deficiency. So have a little look through this list and see if there's anything here that you're resonating with. As I said, maybe now, in the past, or potentially if you're about to start a low carb diet, these are things that you want to look out for going forward. So one that is relevant to me is dizziness on standing. I know that if I haven't had enough salt, I will literally see stars when I stand up from a seated position. And I want to look down at the low blood sodium levels. So go down to the bottom of the list and we'll focus on this one for a second. Because most people will kind of like show me their blood tests and say, well, my blood levels of sodium are normal, so therefore I can't have a sodium deficiency. But as much as low blood sodium levels do tell us you have a serious deficiency, normal blood sodium levels do not rule out a deficiency. And that's because if you're not eating enough sodium through your diet, your body will just pull sodium from its stored reservoir. And your stored reservoir is your bones. So your body will literally pull sodium, calcium, and magnesium from your bones if you are not eating enough salt on a daily basis. This can clearly lead to bone health issues down the track, but it really emphasizes that you need to tune into these signs and symptoms because we can't rely on a blood test to tell us whether or not our sodium is low or normal. And a question I often get in clinic are all salts created equal? So on the screen, you can see that there's different categories for salt. So table salt, sea salt, mineral salts, and sodium that's in foods. And all of these salts do contain sodium, and sodium is the essential mineral that we are talking about today. But there are pros and cons to different types of salts. The one that I like the most is the mineral salts. And that's because not only do they contain sodium, but they contain other essential minerals like iodine, magnesium, and potassium. So this would be like pink Himalayan salt and colored salts. My favorite mineral salt is Redmond's Real Salt. And this is an example, well, this is the mineral analysis on the screen. And you can see that this salt contains over 60 different minerals that are so important in the function of our bodies. And these are minerals naturally contained in the salt in their appropriate forms and quantities relative to each other. As an example, 1.5 teaspoons of Redmond's Real Salt gives you 100% of the RDI, which is the recommended daily intake for iodine. And we know iodine deficiency is very common in Australia, and it can lead to things like hypothyroid. So it's very important that we focus on increasing more salt for other reasons and other nutrients which we are lacking. Okay, so I want to finish off with a story that is near and dear to my heart. So this little boy here is actually Thomas Parvola, who is not only my colleague, but he's also my partner of 4 years. Since the age of 7, Tom has suffered from 2 to 4 migraines every single week. He says that the pain is unbearable. It feels like someone is smashing my head with a hammer for 3 hours straight. And if you or someone you know suffers from migraines, you'll know how scary the neurological symptoms can be. Tom's neurological symptoms are particularly bad, and it is very difficult to see sometimes whether or not he's having a migraine or maybe even having a stroke. And fatigue and exhaustion is particularly common in people who suffer from migraines. They can have extreme physical and mental fatigue leading up to a migraine, but also after a migraine. And this can lead to impaired immunity and impaired long-term health. So Tom's migraines didn't stop him from leading a pretty active life for many years. Tom was a competitive sprinter, and when I met him, he was training about 3 to 4 hours a day on 5 to 6 days of the week. And Tom also wasn't, you know now that he's a dietitian, you heard from him yesterday, but when he completed his dietetics degree, he wasn't all that enthused about what he learned at uni, and I think a lot of people can understand why. So he decided to start his own business doing something completely different. So he was doing a concreting trade, which meant he was on his feet, lifting heavy things for 4 to 6 hours of the day. He also led a very active lifestyle too. And I'll come back to why this information is very important in a minute. So when Tom and I met, our ideas about nutrition were not exactly in alignment. Tom was an athlete, so carbohydrates were a big part of his diet. And he didn't want to hear anything that maybe could help from a nutritional perspective with his migraines. And that's because by this point, Tom had been working with specialists for about 2 decades, trying to figure out what caused his migraines and how he could prevent them. He had done allergy testing, he had done elimination diets, he had done drugs, and he'd done multiple alternative therapies, and nothing helped with his migraines. So he was kind of at the point where he's thinking, well, this is just my life. But about 2 years into our relationship, he had 5 migraines in a row. And by the end of that week, he couldn't string together a sentence, he could hardly walk down the hallway, and he developed pneumonia because his immune system was so shot. It was at this point where he decided he needed to give up his active lifestyle and focus on diet again to see what role it could play in his migraines, and he decided he would do this with my support. So the first thing he tried was go gluten-free. So the idea here was that gluten might be contributing to some inflammation. Even though he didn't have celiac disease, we decided to give it a go anyway. And it actually really helped to reduce his migraine frequency by about 50%. So Tom was really happy, and he still stays gluten-free to this day. The next thing we did was reduce carbohydrates, and Tom actually sort of pursued a ketogenic diet where he was testing his ketones. And the idea here was that people with migraines have increased energy demand. So the migraine brain is hypersensitive, and things like low blood sugars and just low energy availability can actually trigger a migraine. So we thought that having lots of ketones in his system would help to provide an alternative fuel to the brain and also help to reduce inflammation further. And so after about 6 months of tweaking his diet, Tom's migraine frequency reduced again by about 50% to 1 to 2 migraines every 14 days. Now, obviously, Tom was so happy with this achievement, but 1 to 2 migraines every 14 days is still really debilitating, and they were really affecting his quality of life. So he knew he needed to do something else. Increasing salt was the most important thing Tom has done to reduce his frequency of migraines. After learning about the inverse relationship between migraines and sodium and the importance of sodium for the brain, Tom significantly increased his salt, and his migraine frequency reduced to 1 migraine every 6 weeks, which was pretty amazing. Now, when you look at Tom's sodium losses versus his intake at the time where he was doing lots of that competitive sprinting and also that physical labor, you can see that on a typical day, Tom was losing about 10,000 milligrams of sodium every day. And that was basically a minimum loss, because if you actually add up the things on the screen, it leads to a lot more than 10,000 milligrams a day loss. So he was losing over 4 teaspoons of salt every single day. Now, if you look at his intake, you can see that we added up all the sodium-rich foods, and Tom didn't add any salt to his foods back then. And so you can see that his intake was only 2,000 milligrams a day, which is consistent with the suggested dietary target. But you can see that his losses are so much higher than his intake. And now that we understand how important sodium is, we can see why Tom was getting so many migraines. And that's not to say that a low sodium or a sodium deficiency was the only thing contributing to Tom's migraines, but it definitely played a massive role. So I'm just going to leave you with a bit of a thought-provoking question. It is a fact that water is important. We all know that we have to drink water every single day, otherwise we will die. But what is more dangerous to the body? A loss of water or a loss of sodium? I'll leave that with you. Thank you.